Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for a class for Monday, September 30th, where we are in the midst of discussing some short stories and also thinking about our first paper, which won't be due until the midpoint in the semester. Though, as you know, I have rolling deadlines, so I encourage you to submit in papers earlier rather than later. But at this particular point, you have the paper topics that we have talked about before, where I'm asking you to consider either canon or contemporary relevance. You can create your own paper topic if you're not happy with those paper topics. They do have to be directed to one of the texts we've examined this semester, which for us would be the film Citizen Kane or the short stories we are in the midst of now. And you do need to get the topic approved by me. So I'm hopeful that at this point you're beginning to think about the paper. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the construction of writing papers. And I also wanted to talk about the short story, The Story of an Hour. Now, we had talked about A Sorrowful Woman last class, and if nothing else, I think you can see the level of depth and sophistication that that piece has as compared to the first piece it was paired with, The Secret Sorrow. And the themes of A Sorrowful Woman are themes that are rather eerily familiar if you've read The Story of an Hour. Not too surprising that the author of A Sorrowful Woman has a PhD, Gail Godwin, in English, and she would have been very familiar with The Story of an Hour. It's considered to be a canonical work written by Kate Chopin, very famous author in the 1800s, who in this short story, it's only a page long or so, details a life-changing hour about a woman who feels trapped in marriage. Keep in mind how similar this would be to what we saw with The Sorrowful Woman, even though A Sorrowful Woman was written in the 1900s, 1970s, not the 1800s. Note that The Story of an Hour does not provide us with a child, which makes the story a little bit less complex, perhaps, because we don't have that additional layer of a woman's responsibility to her children. But the world would have been radically different in 1894, even from the 1970s, where female would have little autonomy and little voice and no possibility of divorce and no ability to own property and no ability to basically express dissatisfaction without social ostracization. And while we might have experienced that in the 70s, keep in mind that the 70s was a much more progressive time than what we would have seen in the late 1800s. So Kate Chopin is usually identified as an early feminist writer, and oftentimes uses bird imagery in her writing to illustrate the trapped nature of female. So knowing a little bit about Kate Chopin's background can be useful in terms of understanding her writing. It's no mistake that Mallard is the surname for our central character. And a mallard is a bird. It's a duck. It's a very common duck. I oftentimes in class ask individuals to do a little bit of research about mallards, and what they find out is that this is a domesticated bird, which works very nicely in terms of thinking about the theme of domestication in this particular story. That they mate for life, but that the males are oftentimes known to stray, and that perhaps can also be embedded into some of the social systems in the human world. The male mallard is rather colorful, and it's the female mallard that's rather dull. One could argue that in this particular time period, it's the male who gets all of the attraction and all of the attention. Notice that Mr. Mallard is given a name right at the very beginning of this story. His name is Brentley. He's given individual identity in a way that Mrs. Mallard is not. And even think about today how the distinction between Mr. and Mrs. illustrates marital status in a way that Mr. never could or would. There's a separate status, Miss, in order to denote female marital status. So already there's a distinction in relation to titles about the importance of female and her marital status in a way that we don't necessarily see with male. We do get the female name as the story progresses. We get Louise, and Louise, if the male root is Louis. You might have noticed, again, the reference perhaps, or the focus on the male. Um, and her sister, Josephine, also with the male root at the beginning of the name, Joseph. The sister is given a female name, or a first name, I should say, right at the very beginning of the story, perhaps because she's unmarried. And what we get in the story of an hour is about this foreshadowing when we're told that Mrs. Mallard has heart trouble rather than heart disease. And there is a distinction. At the ending of the piece, we're told that she has heart disease. Heart trouble, the suggestion is that this is more emotional rather than physical. And when Mrs. Mallard is told, mistakenly it turns out, by a family friend that her husband has died in a railroad accident, she goes off by herself. That in and of itself would have raised eyebrows during this time period. And while she wept at once, then she begins to realize the possibilities of freedom that will be afforded to her as a widow. A really interesting sociological fact during this time period is that it was much more common for males to remarry when they lost a spouse than it was for females. And there are probably multiple reasons for this, but I would suspect that part of it had to do with power. That if a female, particularly if there were no heirs, and no heirs are mentioned in this story, was had lost her spouse and was now a widow, that she could retain a certain level of dignity and status, and also economic power if there weren't heirs. So perhaps there was less of an impetus to remarry. And we do know that this piece, as short as it is filled with imagery. In fact, I've oftentimes argued that the shorter the work, the more well written it probably is, in order for us to really appreciate the literary elements associated with it if it's going to be included in canon, because every word counts, unlike a novel where perhaps you could have 10 or 20 pages that aren't perhaps superior, but in a story that's only a page and a half long, every word has to count. And just some of the symbols that I wanted to draw your attention to: an open window. Windows are oftentimes seen as positives. Think about how a sorrowful woman was looking out the window. The fact that the window is open, the possibilities of freedom and opportunity. The roomy armchair. An armchair is made for one person, not for two. It's not like a sofa or a love seat. And the fact that it's roomy and comfortable. We would have gotten a very different sense of things if Mrs. Mallard was seated on, let's say, a wooden bench. The open square that she looks at before her. Again, this possibility of expansiveness. The springtime, and we know that the seasons are oftentimes representational of different stages in life or different emotional states. The idea that spring is a new beginning. Sparrows. And I've already mentioned that Kate Chopin loved to talk about birds as symbols for female. A bird could be trapped in a cage, a female could be trapped in a home, or a bird could be set free and spread its wings. Rain, which oftentimes comes with some negative associations, but think about some of the positives associated with rain, that it's cleansing and that it also is needed for life. And even that rain is negated with the idea that blue skies are coming. And we're even told a direction, west, in terms of the clouds. And if we're given a specific direction, it probably has some significance to it. Think about westward expansion and the idea of hope and opportunity, which could be represented by west, or the idea of a setting sun, and of course the rising sun afterwards. This is the ending of one thing and the beginning of another, as we see through Mrs. Mallard, who's now Louise, who's young, which is not expected for somebody who has heart disease, but again, she has heart trouble, and also repressed. And she feels something creeping towards her. Creeping has a lot of negative connotations associated with it. And it's something that she doesn't necessarily want. And so finally she's able to accept it and says, free, free, free. Free, body and soul free. In other words, she is beginning to feel freedom. What a wonderful quote that would be, to talk about her feeling free. and that what little we learn of Brentley, which is very little because it's only a page and a half long, is all positive. That he had kind, tender hands and he never looked save with love upon her. So we couldn't argue that the reason why she wants freedom from this relationship is because she was misused or abused. It's the same that we saw with the sorrowful woman. Her husband tries his best to help her, but the best that he can offer is not what she needs. And we can't necessarily fault him because she's not even able to articulate what she needs. Again, think about the time period where issues of mental health would not be openly addressed. Though the more interesting piece, I think, about A Sorrowful Woman is not that the sorrowful woman is depressed or has mental health issues, it's about why. And it would seem that a wife and mother one too many times is the answer to that. That this is somebody who feels entrapped by the roles of wife and mother. And well, Mrs. Mallard is not a mother. She's certainly a wife, and she's beginning to experience, as Louise, what she might have. She could live for herself. And my favorite line in the story, which is in the notes below, is that there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. I love this quote because usually the story is read in terms of the lens of female, and this opens it up so that we can talk about it in the context of marriage as a whole, that men and women basically impose their will upon the other. And again, the time period I think is very important. So the assumption is that a marriage is between a man and a woman. So obviously, a piece that would be written in more contemporary times would probably be more inclusive. So while she says she loved him only sometimes. If anybody's ever experienced the complex emotion of love, then you know how it can be tinged by hate. And think about how oftentimes we can experience dual emotions at the same time. We talk about something being bittersweet. It can be bitter and sweet at the same time. And she's thinking about spring days and summer days. All of this is associated with something that's positive. And then, of course, we get the ironic twist ending, which is oftentimes what you find in a short story is an ironic twist ending. Her husband hadn't been killed at all. He'd been far from the scene of the accident. We can speculate as to why this mistake was made, that he was killed in the accident, but all we can do is speculate because there isn't enough evidence in the text to be able to suggest that this was done deliberately or maliciously, that it was just purely an error on Richard's part. But we do know that he's fine, and while they try to shield his image from his wife, that ultimately she's overcome from joy that kills. And the assumption is that she's died of a heart attack, of heart disease, but we also know that it's a troubled heart. And yes, she might be relieved that he's alive. She did love him, albeit sometimes, and she did note his kind hands. But we know what the other characters don't know because we were with her in that room when she was alone, and that ultimately she has to accept the fact that the freedom that she was beginning to enjoy has been snatched away from her. So it could be possible that she feels both relief and happiness and despair and depression at the same time. So joy that kills is much more complex than what the doctors and her family members think. One of my favorite things about this story, if you are reading the story in our textbook, are the questions that occur afterwards, just to show how subjective a reading can be. Asking us, do we see or feel certain level of sympathy and empathy for Mrs. Mallard, or do we see her as a kind of monster for being so happy about the fact that she's achieved freedom, or is it possible to see a little bit of both at the same time? And how might our interpretations of the story, how might those interpretations be informed by things like our gender or our ethnicity or age? Age is particularly fascinating because age is constantly changing. Or marital status. So I've oftentimes told my students it would be a fascinating experiment to teach this story to two classes back to back, one of recent newlyweds and one of recent divorced couples. And my suspicion is that they would focus on very different pieces of evidence and have very different interpretations, both equally valid as long as you have evidence in the text in order to be able to support your interpretation. So, or your socioeconomic status, or your perspective about marriage. There's so many variables that are involved in terms of how you interpret. There is subjectivity involved, and arguing that we're going to be objective is not the reality when it comes to human beings. Human beings are subjective. So it's understanding that we all have bias and then acknowledging what that bias is and how that might influence our interpretation of the work. So these two short stories are certainly possibilities for your paper, as is the film Citizen Kane. And as I indicated, I wanted you to write a critical paper, not a research paper. So I don't expect you to do any kind of outside research. You would be putting together the arguments that you've learned through class, whether it be through class videos or through the discussion forum responses, probably a combination of the two. And in the syllabus and other documents folder, you'll see that I have uploaded a handout about how to write the critical paper, which I hope is just basically review for you about how to write a critical paper from previous English classes. I can tell you that this was a handout that was distributed to me in my undergraduate days many moons ago, and I find it to still be useful, which is why I've kept it and why I give it to my own students. Basically, it divides up the writing process into 3 stages: the planning stage, the writing stage, and the editing stage. And I can tell you that most writers skip the planning stage. So I really want to emphasize that you spend some time now planning, thinking about what you might want to write about. And you may not know yet, which is fine. We have other short stories coming up. What most writers do is they skip immediately to the writing stage and try to write the perfect first sentence. And they end up losing a lot of time doing that. So I encourage you to spend time with planning. And because they oftentimes wait until the very last minute for the writing stage, there isn't any time for the editing stage. So you want to start early so there's time for editing. And you all have the option of rewriting that first paper, as I indicated. I see it as a kind of learning exercise. I just ask that you submit in the original with my comments on it, along with your revision. You get the higher of the 2 grades. And you have up until the ending of the semester to do that, so you have some time. But I just wanted to talk about that handout, the critical paper, and emphasize just a few pieces of information that should be helpful to you, though I encourage you to print it up, have a hard copy of it, so that you can reference it easily. In the planning stage, remember, you're analyzing, you're not summarizing, you're not writing what I call the junior high school book report. So assume the reader has some familiarity with the text. You're merely restating those pieces that are important for your particular argument. Or a grammatical way of saying that is confine your comments on plot to subordinate clauses, emphasizing the main clause, the significance of that action. So the bulk of your sentences should be devoted to interpretation. Now, you need to have a specific thesis, a position upon which reasonable people could disagree. And it's usually put in the first paragraph. Now, this one is tricky because how do you know what your paper is about until you've written it? I'm very well aware that the exercise of writing a paper is discovering your thesis. So you don't necessarily have to write in chronological order. You might end up writing a few body paragraphs and then reread what you've written, summarize it in a sentence or two, and plug it into your introduction. That would be your thesis. So you want to make sure that your thesis is specific and meaningful. So you don't want to say something like Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. That is so general, it applies to every author and every text that we would be studying. Or saying something like Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. Again, that's applicable to most authors. What's important is what imagery is employed and why. That would be your thesis. So, as you are writing your paragraphs, each paragraph should be minimum 3 sentences. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, which I know is somewhat different from, let's say, journalistic writing, where you can write 1-sentence paragraphs. But the writing that we do in academia is very similar to the expectations of the writing that you would do in the workplace. So you have developed paragraphs. And well-written paragraphs have a topic sentence, which is a first sentence that usually summarizes what the paragraph is about. All of your paragraphs don't need to do this, but Most of them should. So if you were to read just the first sentences of your paragraphs, you should get an outline at the ending of your paper. You might even want to try this with some books. Textbooks are notoriously poorly written, but if you've got a well-written textbook, you should be able to read the first lines of each paragraph. Keep in mind that a paragraph is just a division in order to make things easier for the reader, and that division is based on what the topic is of your paragraph. And your topic can be broad or it can be very specialized. That's up to you. And usually that's indicated in that first sentence, that topic sentence. Support. My job is basically to take the opposite position of whatever it is you're saying. So you need to provide evidence, much like a courtroom attorney needs to come up with pieces of evidence. And I've oftentimes used this analogy that a good attorney can argue guilty or innocent, defense or prosecution. It's the same evidence. They're just picking and choosing. And outside of the morality of it, a good lawyer can make either side look plausible. So what you're doing is you're picking and choosing your pieces of evidence, which is basically made up of paraphrase, your own language, and also quotation, word for word, which you document with quotation marks, and then immediately after the quotation, you in parentheses would either indicate the page number or in terms of film, you would put the timestamp if you were quoting from a particular element of, let's say, Citizen Kane. And we'll talk a little bit more about quoting as the semester goes on. Generally speaking, you want to avoid ending a paragraph in a quote. It's considered bad practice because you usually comment on the relevance. And you will have multiple body paragraphs. At the very least, a paper needs to have a beginning, a middle, and end, just like a paragraph needs a beginning, middle, and end. So that's an introduction, a body, and a conclusion for the paper. But you want to have multiple paragraphs in your body. You might have heard of the 5-paragraph essay, which is fine, but you don't want to limit yourself to 5 paragraphs. There's no reason not to have 6 or 7 or 8 paragraphs. So basically, you end with a concluding paragraph that needs to be just as developed as any other paragraph, so minimum 3 sentences. And I understand that by the ending, you've run out of energy and you've said everything. Try to find an interesting way to conclude. Perhaps you can relate your text to another text by the same author, or another author is doing something similar, or perhaps you can relate things to contemporary times, though that happens to be actually a paper topic that you could pursue if you so wanted to. But that almost always works with all conclusions, by the way. So that's a little hint on how to conclude. So start with ideas, whether you're just brainstorming ideas, you're just writing out ideas, knowing that most of those ideas you may not even pursue. Or whether you're journaling. Keep in mind the textbook also gave you some ideas on how to go about writing a paper, so you might want to revisit those pages. Journaling is much like keeping a diary, but rather than writing about your personal life, you are writing about, well, the text you're reading in this instance. Once you have ideas, then you can begin to organize them in the order in which you think you might be likely to talk about them. Then you can begin to construct sentences and paragraphs around them. So that's the writing piece. That's the second piece. Another option, that I oftentimes did this when I was writing a paper. I would gather the quotes that I thought I wanted to discuss, and I would put them in the order in which I thought I wanted to discuss them, and then I would construct paragraphs around them. What that would give me is a draft. So, of course, I would need to develop that draft. And please pay attention to the writing section of the handout where it says the first principle of good writing is economy and the second is simplicity. Write as much as possible in as few words as possible. It truly is my greatest challenge as a writer, and yes, English teachers have challenges with writing, being concise. You should be able to go through each sentence that you've written, and hopefully there's enough time to do this, and ask yourself, can I restate this in fewer words and not sacrifice meaning? And 9 out of 10 times, that's exactly what you should do. And I know how discouraging this can be, because now your 4-page paper is a 3-page paper. Better to have well-written 3-page paper than a poorly written 4-page paper. A lot of what I do when I evaluate writing is I delete things, either something that's repetitious, something you've already stated, or that uses a lot of language that's unnecessary. So you're using 10 words to express something you could have used 4 words with. And good writing depends on strong verbs and nouns. Verb being an action word, a noun, person, place, thing, or idea. Adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words, those are fine, but you don't want to use them to pad the paper. Just like you don't want to use quotation to pad the paper, that you're just putting it in there for length. You do need to use quotation, but you don't want to overuse quotes because you have nothing to say. Active to the passive voice, this is just a little trick in terms of being concise, but it also is in terms of being a better writer. So you want it to be very clear that the subject of the sentence, who or what is doing the action, is engaging in the action. In other words, Lillian graded the papers, where it's very clear that the subject of the sentence, who or what is doing the action, Lillian, is engaged in the grading. Lillian graded the papers is 4 words long. I could say the same thing and say the papers were graded by Lillian. While that's grammatically correct, it's considered the passive voice. It's as if the grading is happening to the subject of the sentence, Lillian. But it also is longer, and there's no need to use more language than is necessary to express a thought. Now, this takes time, so hopefully you have finished your writing early enough so that you can actually set it aside so that you can go to it with a fresh eye and begin looking at things like, how do I make my sentences stronger and more concise? You want to vary your sentences. You don't want to have too many long sentences. That's too dense for our reader. You don't want too many short sentences. That could be very choppy. You certainly don't want to begin sentences all in the same way, especially if they're next to one another. And avoid things like cliches and trite expressions, words and expressions that have been used so frequently that they no longer have original meaning. Little piece of trivia here. Many of those expressions were created by Shakespeare, as we will discuss when we get to our Shakespeare section, that people quote Shakespeare all the time and don't even realize they're quoting Shakespeare. But better to say something in your original language, and better to avoid slang, which is informal language, language that's usually created by a group to exclude another group. It's what adolescents do every generation. And yes, I know that slang can go mainstream, so it seems like everybody is using it, and that expressions might be used so frequently it seems like everybody understands them and is using them. But imagine if English were not your first language, second, third, fourth language, how difficult it would be to understand some of these expressions that we use. For instance, it's raining cats and dogs. What do cats and dogs have to do with rain? And why do cats go first before dogs? Or think about slang, where, you've learned that when you say somebody is hot, that this isn't in regards to their temperature, this is in regards to their physical attractiveness. But then you can also say someone is cool, and that's also positive, that's about their personality. I always give a short story about a true life short story about why these rules exist. They aren't just arbitrary. And yeah, they're created by the MLA, the Modern Language Association, which hopefully sounds familiar to you. It's that professional organization that comes up with the rules of writing and quotation. And the reason why they did this is because there's a greater possibility of misunderstanding when you are using slang or overused expressions. And my real life story illustrates this. Happened a few decades ago, so it was quite a while ago, in the 90s actually. And it was about a second language student who was going to a party who unfortunately went to the wrong house, a house that had been burglarized previously. So let's just say the owner was anxious. And the student knocks on the door, and the owner answers and opens the door, and the student asks, "Is this where the party is happening?" And the owner responded with a piece of slang that I suspect most, if not all of you, know. He said freeze, which means to stop in this context. But the student, for whatever reason, whether he misheard or misunderstood, took a step forward, the exact opposite of stopping. The owner responded by pulling out his gun, which he always carried, and shooting it off and killing that student on his doorstep because of misunderstanding. So The idea of having some standardization, and that's not to say that you don't need to know the language of the streets, so to speak, because we speak very differently than we write. But when we're writing in the workplace or in academia, we expect a certain level of formality so that there is a lesser chance of misunderstanding. So, couple of other things. You don't need to use I in an academic paper. I think, I believe. You don't have to say, I believe that Citizen Kane is searching for love. That's wordy. You can just say, Citizen Kane is searching for love. The assumption is the entire paper is what you think or believe. Contractions. So those are ways that you contract two words and make them into one word. Can't, don't, won't, things of that nature. We use them all the time when we speak. Try to avoid them in formal writing. So say cannot, do not, will not. It's considered to be a little bit more formal. It's not an error, it's just a question of style. But I was schooled in a very traditional way, so I pass that on to my students. The third part of the handout is about proofreading. So you do want to save some time at the end to proofread. And if you have trouble concentrating, try reading backwards. Read from page 4 and work your way to page 1, and you'll be likely to find errors there. Title. You should have a title, and your title should be original. So you don't want to call your paper A Sorrowful Woman, for instance, if you're writing about a sorrowful woman. That title's already been taken. So you want something that's original, but you can embed the author's title within your own title. So you could talk about something like isolation in A Sorrowful Woman. So some conventions when you are referencing titles that have been published. So pieces of literature, for instance. Short stories and shorter works such as poems are put in quotation marks. So if you ever see the title in quotation marks, that means it is a published short story or a poem. We either underline or italicize the names of novels or longer works, such as plays. That gives you an idea if you're reading something shorter or longer. You don't need to do that with your own title because your own work has not been published. So you don't need to underline it or italicize it or put it in quotation marks. That said, if you're using the author's title within your own title, such as Isolation in A Sorrowful Woman, then A Sorrowful Woman would be put in quotation marks because that is a published short story. Identify the author and the work along with your thesis in your introductory paragraph because it should be clear to the reader what you are talking about. You want to make sure, and this goes to show you how old this handout is. It says instructors prefer typewritten pages. Papers, I have to chuckle. The paper must be typed. Double space, 1-inch margins. Hopefully this is formatting that you talked about in English 101. It also is included on our syllabus under the section on papers. And also we'll talk about it a little bit more when the semester progresses and we're getting a little bit closer to the due date. And what I have done for you is in the section critical papers, I've included some points about all of these things, as well as a couple of websites that you might find useful for you. Purdue OWL is a website that was put out by Purdue University that talks about the entire writing process. You might have heard of this website before. And they make that website available to everyone, and you don't have to be a student at Purdue. Or another website that sometimes students forget, our own GCC library website, and I've included a link for that as well, because after all, our librarians are well aware you'll be writing papers, so there'll be information about that. So the Purdue website is great because it'll also talk about grammar and mechanics, and I know that sometimes is somewhat frustrating to students. For instance, punctuation. But remember, punctuation just clarifies meaning. It's what you do with when you're speaking orally. There's a difference when you say sit down as opposed to sit down. You can hear that difference, but when you're writing, you can't hear it, which is why you would use a question mark, sit down, as opposed to an exclamation point. Sit down. So that said, those are some of the points that I wanted to emphasize. And since we've talked about 2 short stories at this point, A Sorrowful Woman's Story of an Hour, that's what our attendance question will be about. Due Wednesday the 2nd. Of course, if you need an extension, let me know. And you aren't required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. Which story did you prefer? A Sorrowful Woman or The Story of an Hour? And why? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm really more interested in the why piece in your reasoning. So, next class we'll continue on with some more short stories and also talking about the paper. We'll talk about A Rose for Emily. You'll see that I've also included some links for some upcoming pieces that we will be reading, such as Young Goodman Brown, such as Soldier's Home, and such as Battle Royal. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about short stories and the paper. Take care. Bye-bye.